All right, so what's next? I think we wanted to refine the rings a little bit more, so I'll just show you a couple of little things that I thought worked reasonably well. So we can use the knife tool to kind of dig into these a little bit more. So I've got the knife tool selected, and see how much strength I've got. The strength is pretty low here, so bring the strength and the radius up a little bit and kind of sort of sculpt in a bit. And that's going to, if I'm not careful, that's going to create some artifacts there. I could turn on the steady stroke if I want those to be a bit smoother and make things a little more easy for me. So I can just kind of going along these rings and accentuating the definition in the rings. And we could also do that for where this clitellum is. So I can make this definition here. I should do this off the rings layer. Whoops, I accidentally got the marking menu there. I can also smooth this area. And similarly with this, I can smooth out the ring adjacent to the clitellum and maybe sort of build this up a little bit more. Smooth this out. And then with the knife tool, continuing on sort of having that a little bit more defined. And then again with the knife tool, just kind of stroking a little bit more accentuation along here. And then the final thing that I'm going to do with these rings, which again I realize I'm not sculpting on the rings layer, but oops. The final thing to sort of really get these rings looking how I want them to is using the pinch tool. So with the pinch, I'm going to use a reasonably large brush size, and I'm just going to sculpt along the length of those. And that's going to do a couple of things. It's going to kind of smooth out the areas on the segments, but it's also going to bring those little gaps closer together. And it's going to create, to my eye, something that's more looking more segmented, right? So just kind of really quickly, roughly painting over those. You can see how that kind of smooths out sort of the lumpiness that the knife tool created, and also really tightens that up. Okay. And again, with the smooth tool, I can kind of smooth out some of these areas that I think are a little gross. So I'm not going to work on the back end too much, but obviously it's exactly the same process here. That would be here. So what's next? Well, let's take a look at making the setae. And so as a reminder, those are the sort of little hair-like projections, and they have this kind of projection here and then a little thing sticking at the top. And so that's going to be, I mean, it's going to be doable, but it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to do that on all of them because there's so many of them. It's going to be time consuming and tedious rather. So there's actually a way that we can make a custom stencil so that we can just make a stencil for one of these and use it multiple times. So let's see how that works. I'm going to go into my object list and hide the earthworm base by clicking on this little circle under the eye icon, and that's going to hide it. I'm going to go create mesh plane, and that's going to create a simple two-dimensional plane in the middle of the view here. I'm going to call this plane, I'm just going to click on it and call this one target. And I'm going to lock it and hide it. Okay, so what was that about? Well, that's going to form the baseline for how our setae is going to be extruded from, essentially. So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to go create mesh plane, and this one I'm going to call source. And so this is going to have the painted setae, or the sculpted setae, on it, and that's going to be projected onto a flat plane. And the reason for that is essentially what we're doing, the end goal is to create a two-dimensional image that represents the sculpted detail that we want. So I'm just going to click off the source object, but it's available to us to sculpt on. So I'm going to hit Shift D 1, 2, maybe 3 times to get up to level 5, because it already came in at with 3 levels. I am going to use the sculpt tool again. So we've got 2 planes. One is called target, and that one is not subdivided, and it is locked. And we've got another plane, and that one's called source. The name isn't important, but that's what its function is source. That's the one that we've subdivided, and that's the one that we're going to paint on or sculpt on. So with the sculpt tool selected, I am going to turn off mirroring, because we don't really want mirroring for this. And I'm going to reset the fall off curve by clicking on one of the fall off curves down here. I'm going to make the brush, I'm going to make the brush nice and large, and the strength quite large as well. And I'm just going to sculpt up something here. Maybe that's a little big, something like that. Maybe I'll go from the top view and kind of make sure it's roughly pyramidal. So this is the base of the setae that we're sculpting in. And then the top of it, again, depending on the references that you find and how you want to do it, I'm going to sort of flatten the top of it. So I'm going to look kind of from the top view and use the flatten tool to sort of flatten the top of it there. Just click somewhere else in the object list. Click on source and then click down below it. Yes and no. So if the question was, can you use the grab tool? So if you took the grab tool, you could pull it up, but if you see, it's actually pointing off to the side. So the grab tool works sort of perpendicular or sort of against where the camera is. So you would kind of have to be really sort of side view and sort of kind of go for it. So that would work, but I found the sculpt tool is a little bit simpler. Okay, so again, for the next part of the little setae, I'm going to make the brush a bit smaller and kind of sculpt out something like that. Maybe make the brush a bit bigger. Sculpt out something like that and kind of smooth it a bit. You could also use the pinch tool to sort of make it a bit pointier, although that might be a little ugly. But then here we can use the grab tool and kind of grab it out. And one thing I noticed in the reference image, I don't know if this is a universal truth, but the hairs are not perfectly, they're not sticking straight out. They have a little bit of a curve to it, presumably because the earthworm uses them to kind of hook the ground a bit. So I'm going to sort of smooth this, and then with the grab tool and a big brush, I'm going to use the control function of the grab tool and kind of rotate around. So I'm going to make the brush a bit bigger and use the control key and sort of take that, and then with the regular grab function I can kind of shape that a little bit. So I don't know, maybe that's kind of a, and now because we're going to be making well, I'll talk about the displacement map in a sec. The last thing I kind of want to do is maybe with the wax tool just add a little bit of fill to this. So the wax tool just kind of adds sort of fill to areas. And this probably isn't accurate, but I'm just going to add a little bit of texture here just for fun. Kind of shallow out that curve. And then with the smooth tool, just kind of come back around and sort of smooth out. Okay, so now we've got this kind of setae thing sticking out, and now we can actually use this to generate a stencil that we're going to be using on our actual model. So the way that we do that is we go to UVs and maps, extract texture maps, and new operation. And I can call this something like CT vector displacement map, and for future reference. And basically that's just the operations. You can save the settings for them and do them again in the future. So I'm going to choose vector displacement map. And as soon as I click vector displacement map, all of these settings, this complex looking dialog comes out. And the way that this dialog works is it wants to look at a source model with sculpted detail. And that's what we've got here, the source model with sculpted detail, and the target model, which is the base mesh. And that was our original plane. And it's going to look at the differences between those, basically how much the polygons have been displaced. Whoops, did I lose my dialogue? Probably. And it's going to create a texture map that represents that change in distance. So for the target model, it's quite a helpful dialog actually. This is the low resolution mesh. So we want to choose target here. And it's a bit annoying that the dialog comes or disappears all the time. But anyways, so we've got the target selected in the object list, and we're going to click add selected. And the target's going to come in, and it's going to say level 0, and you could change one of the other levels that it has, but level 0 is fine because the plane actually hasn't changed in any of those levels, the original plane. Okay. Now we also want to select the source, and our window has once again disappeared behind the other one. Select the source, and we're going to hit add selected for the source model, which is the high resolution mesh. And we want to make sure if we click on it that level 5 is selected. That's the high resolution version that we've been sculpting. Okay, and so these default settings, this smooth target models, use creases and hard edges, should be fine, although sometimes I found that sometimes those can cause problems or issues, and we'll revisit some of those settings. We're going to generate one map for all targets, and how big do we want this? I think 1024 is probably sufficient detail here. So this is basically going to create a 1K texture map. Anti-aliasing off. And the vector space, we're going to use relative tangent. And the map type is texture, and we're also going to choose a base file name. So if we click on the dotted line, or the ellipsis button here, the ... we can go navigate back to our project. And this is why I like how Maya remembers where your project files are set up, so that you can actually automatically jump into a folder. So we're going to choose the textures folder here, and we're going to name this CT DISP for displacement, although it's going to add a suffix for us as well. And we want to make sure that we choose TIFF 32-bit floating point. I think the OpenEXR would work just as well, but for this, we're just going to choose a TIFF 32-bit. Hit save, and it's going to give a little dialog. If you're planning on using it, then the file name must contain _VDM, and that's for vector displacement map. So yes, we will add VDM to the file name. And so you can see that I just added a little suffix here. And then we click extract. And it's going to go through and calculate everything that it needs to do here, and it's going to take a minute or two. Map extraction finished successfully. That's great. So we'll hit close. And in order to actually use this, we need to jump over to the image browser. So that's the third tab in the window here. And the image browser is basically a file browser that allows you to look at textures that you can use for painting and stamps and stencils. So I'm going to click on this folder directory to open up the folder that we want to add here. And again, we want to navigate back to this, and I'm going to choose the textures folder, and I'm going to hit choose. And that's going to be taking a look at the textures folder that we had in our project. And if we click on this, we can see that we've got an image texture that doesn't really look like our CT, at least it doesn't yet, but my hope is that that is going to be representative of the detail that we, or the displacement that we added. So in order to actually work with this as a stencil, we need to click on this button, which is the black S with the little green arrow, and that means use this as a stencil. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we have the tool that we want to use it with selected first. So I'm going to click on the Sculpt tool, because that's what we want to use with our stencil. And I'm going to click this button that's going to say use, and we'll see if this works. So in the 3D view, what I'm going to do, you can see that the stencil has come in over the screen. If I hit S, I can rotate this around and move it around and scale it as per the directions here. But we don't want to, obviously we don't want to add this sculpted detail to our target and source planes here. So I'm going to hide the source. And just to see that this is working, I'm going to create a new plane, mesh plane. I'm going to subdivide this a couple of times, and I'm just going to verify that this stencil works. Okay, so I'm going to put this somewhere. The important thing when working with stencils is that you want your brush strength to be set at 100 for this vector displacement textures, and you also probably want your minimum strength set to 100 as well. And so now if we make the brush size bigger, then you can see that as we paint, we get a slightly lower resolution approximation of what we had sculpted out on our when we were making the CT. So now we can bring this down and rotate it around and sculpt. And basically this is an image-based sculpting brush. All right, so enough with the plane. Let's get back to our earthworm base and actually use this. So now that we've got something that is representative of the CT, we can come to the underside of the model. And before we start sculpting, let's make a new layer. Make sure that our earthworm is active here. And we're going to, actually, let's subdivide this one more time. Level 4, level 5. Now we're working with 660,000 polygons. And we're going to add a new layer. And we're going to call this one CT. And to get rid of this yellowness, we can come to the select tools and just click off the object, I think, and then come back to the sculpt tool. Okay. So now we want to actually sculpt this onto the bottom. So let's make sure that the stencil is rotated so that the hairs are going to sort of be facing backwards. And we might want to scale this down a little bit. Make our brush size a little smaller. And let's bring that out. So you can see that we don't have a tremendous amount of detail. We could add some more resolution in order to make sure that this stencil has enough detail. But this will work okay, I think, just to demonstrate the process. So we can kind of come along and add these CT. I think there's supposed to be 4 pairs of CT per segment, but I'm kind of diverging from reality. And maybe on the front ones we can make this smaller. If you hold down S and then click and drag in the viewport, so whenever you turn on a stencil, you should see the stencil tool tip sort of thing coming up at the lower left, and that'll give you the hotkeys for creating the stencils. So you can see that you can fairly easily define a texture or some kind of detail that you want to add to your mesh and duplicate that lots by making this kind of displacement map. And you could probably find lots available online too. If you search for Mudbox vector displacement map textures, then you could probably find others that people have made in order to sort of help with various things. There's probably ones out there for like rivets and bolts, you could imagine, for people doing kind of hard surface mechanical things. I think actually Mudbox ships with an ear vector displacement map. Okay, I've definitely gone overboard with these ones. These are way larger than they would be in reality. That looks kind of scary actually, but demonstrates the function of that particular thing. So when we're done with it, we want to make sure that we click the stencil off, and then it should go away. Okay, so I'm going to subdivide this one more time with Shift D, and this is going to chug a little bit because now we're up to level 6 and we've got 2.6 million polygons, I think. And this is the level that we want to. You can see that this is still very responsive in the scene. If you were in Maya with 2.6 million, I highly doubt that you would be able to do anything interactive with your object. So that's where Mudbox shines. Okay, so looking at our reference again, so I can go back to. You can see that there's some nice textury detail on here, and I don't know if this is particular to this species of worm or whatever. This is an image that I borrowed off of John Hullman's Flickr, just basically doing a Google search for this fantastic image that he's captured of an earthworm. But it seems like between the segments it's quite smooth, and then on the outside surface of it there's this bumpy texture. So let's see if we can recapture that, not wreak havoc on the surface detail. So I'm going to add yet another sculpt layer. I'm going to call this one surface detail. And now we can use some stamps. Okay, so stamps are, as we talked about before the break, stamps are kind of like textured brush tips. And so with the sculpt tool on, or with the sculpt tool, I'm going to select one of these textures. Maybe I'll choose this leaf vein stamp. And I'm going to make sure that randomize is turned on, and so we're going to get some random detail here. I'm going to make the brush a little bit bigger, and I'm going to turn the strength way down. You want some pretty subtle texture here. And then I'm just going to paint, and even that's still way too strong. But the benefit of working on a layer here is that if I'm painting too strong here, I could always bring the strength down and kind of soften that out a bit. So when you're working in these sculpt layers, it can be pretty a good workflow to sort of sculpt a little bit more than you actually need, and then scale it back a little bit, perhaps. Okay, but I'm still gonna turn this down a little bit, and I'm just gonna kind of brush some of this detail over here, and that's probably too much even still. And you'll notice that we've had symmetry turned off, so we could turn on our local Z symmetry and kind of make that a bit more symmetrical. Kind of loosely sort of paint some of that on. Oops. Again, the strength is still quite high. Let's. Kind of going along here. And so we could choose, when making an organic model, there's a few things that really help sell realism. One of them is variation, and so not always being perfectly symmetrical. So we could turn symmetry off and do some more stuff. And the other thing is really perfectly smooth surfaces rarely look very realistic, obviously depending on what you're making. But I think we could add something like this dirt, and then we could turn the invert function off, so we're kind of cutting in, and now we're kind of making maybe turn the strength up just a little bit, making some of these random sort of larger scale kind of bumps and stuff. That's definitely too much. So kind of some asymmetric surface detail. And again, I've only been working really on the front part of this earthworm, but and I can, with the shift key, I can kind of smooth out some of this stuff, sort of add some of it back in. You know, pick some different stencils, or stamps rather. All right, so that's our terrifying earthworm.